A black janitor, dismissed as invisible and insignificant, was the last person anyone expected to have the final say. But in one explosive moment, she not only shut down the CEO's arrogance, she fired him, right in front of the entire company. In a high-rise office building in the heart of the city, the usual hum of productivity filled the air. A group of well-dressed executives moved through the polished hallways, their heels clicking against the marble floors, their voices echoing as they discussed quarterly reports and upcoming deals. This was a place where power, prestige, and wealth converged, and no one expected anything less than perfection. Among the bustling crowd, there was one person who seemed to blend into the background. Her name was Karen, and she was the janitor, a position many in the company had long forgotten about. She wore the standard uniform, a simple blue jumpsuit, her hands always busy with a mop or a cleaning cloth. Karen was a quiet presence, her demeanor humble, as she moved from room to room, making sure everything was spotless. But on the outside, no one paid her much attention. She was just another worker in the company's vast machine, an invisible part of the operation. For Karen, this wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. She had worked in the company for several years, but it wasn't the kind of job that people noticed or celebrated. No one knew her story. No one understood the depth of her character or the strength that simmered beneath her calm exterior. To the executives, she was just a face among many, an unimportant cog in a complex system, but they had no idea what lay within her. The company had always been a place of glaring inequality. In boardrooms where deals were struck, where decisions were made about who would rise and who would fall, Karen had never been part of the conversation. She was a woman of color, and in a world still divided by class and race, her place had always been at the bottom. She wasn't supposed to have power, wasn't meant to be seen as anything more than a worker. Despite this, Karen had a fire within her that no one could see. Her quiet demeanor didn't reflect her intelligence, her resilience, or her potential. She had faced struggles in her life, but they had only made her stronger. She had learned early on that life would never give her anything for free. She would always have to fight for what she deserved, even if the world overlooked her at every turn. In the company's upper floors, the higher-ups would never think twice about her presence. To them, Karen was just part of the background, someone who cleaned their office while they worked, someone who smiled politely when spoken to, but was otherwise ignored. They thought nothing of it when she passed by, her head down, her mop in hand. But deep down, Karen knew something they didn't. She had spent years observing, learning, and waiting for the right moment to step into the light. She understood the dynamics of the company better than anyone realized. While they discussed profits and promotions, she watched the way people interacted, the way power was wielded, and the way they treated those beneath them. Karen knew the world of the powerful was built on nothing but fragility. A slight push could bring it all crashing down. And today, as she pushed her mop down the hallway of the executive floor, she could feel something changing in the air. There was tension brewing, an unsettling buzz that she couldn't quite explain. Little did anyone know, the game was about to change, and Karen was at the center of it all. She wasn't just the janitor. She was much more than that. It was the start of another busy afternoon at the office, the kind of day when the executives were deep into their endless meetings. The hum of voices filled the air, and the sound of phones ringing echoed through the corridors. Karen had just finished wiping down one of the conference rooms when she overheard a group of executives gathered around a long glass table, laughing and joking amongst themselves. They didn't notice her as she worked, her presence almost as if it were invisible to them. But she could hear everything, every word, every snide comment. The laughter died down as the CEO, a tall man in his late 50s, stood up, drawing attention to himself. He was known for his arrogance, his larger-than-life persona, and the way he spoke to others, as though they were beneath him. His name was Victor Donnelly, a man whose success had made him untouchable in the eyes of the company. He moved through life like a king, ruling his employees with an iron fist. To him, Karen was just another faceless worker, someone who cleaned up after him and his team. He never took a moment to acknowledge her, much less see her for the person she was. "Can you believe it?" Victor chuckled, motioning toward his colleagues, his voice carrying in the room. "The janitors are getting more work done than some of the people in this building. Look at her," he continued, pointing to Karen, who had entered the room to retrieve a trash bag. "She's probably thinking she's better than the rest of us because she's cleaning up our mess. Pathetic." The room fell silent for a moment. Karen froze, her hands gripped tightly around the trash bag, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard things like this before, but never directed at her in such a public, personal way. The other executives, some of whom Karen had seen for years, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They looked down at their phones or pretended to focus on the papers in front of them. No one dared to speak up. Victor's smirk deepened as he noticed her tense posture. He took a step closer, still mocking her. "What's the matter? Did you think you were going to clean up this company's act?" He leaned in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe if you focused on your work and less on your dreams of grandeur, you'd actually amount to something more than a cleaning lady. How does it feel to just be the person who sweeps the floors of people like me?" His words stung. They were cruel, demeaning, and designed to belittle her in front of everyone. But what he didn't know was that Karen had been preparing for a moment like this her entire life. He had no idea how much she had seen and heard over the years, how much she had learned by simply watching, listening, and waiting. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze or let the tears sting her eyes, though they were dangerously close. She stood tall, holding the trash bag like a shield, her face a mask of calm. She wasn't going to let him see how much his words had cut her. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Do you want me to clean up this mess too?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it. "Because honestly, you're the one making the biggest mess in this building." There was a long pause. A few of the executives exchanged glances, their eyes wide. They knew Victor was a man who demanded respect, and they knew how brutal he could be when someone challenged him. Yet, in that moment, Karen stood her ground. The other employees in the room shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a word. They were too afraid to speak out, to go against the man who held the keys to their future. Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a brief second, Karen thought she might have gone too far. But then, with a condescending laugh, he stepped back. "You're out of line," he sneered, waving a dismissive hand at her. "Know your place, Karen." But before he could say another word, something shifted in Karen's demeanor. There was a flicker of something, an unmistakable power that seemed to surge through her. She had heard enough, seen enough, and now the moment had arrived. Without saying a word, she turned on her heel and walked towards the back of the room. The sound of her footsteps echoed against the cold marble floor, reverberating through the hall like a drumbeat. She moved with a calm confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you've just unlocked the door to a world where the rules are about to change. Victor watched her go, but what he didn't know was that his words had already sealed his fate. What was about to happen would forever change the balance of power in the room. and the company. And Karen? She was done being invisible. The silence that followed Karen's words hung thick in the air, as if the entire building had stopped breathing for a moment. It was an uncomfortable kind of quiet, the type that made people shift in their seats and glance nervously at one another. Karen, however, didn't hesitate. She kept walking with purpose, as if she were oblivious to the tension swirling behind her. She had made her point. But what happened next? No one could have expected. Victor Donnelly, the CEO, was not a man accustomed to being challenged. He had built his empire by controlling everything and everyone around him, from the people who worked under him to the way he was perceived in the company. No one dared question his authority. His face turned an unnatural shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging as his anger flared. He was used to silencing anyone who dared to defy him. But Karen had done the unthinkable. She had stood up to him, and worse, she hadn't backed down. For a moment it seemed like he would let it go, that he might dismiss her with a sharp reprimand, as he had done to countless others before. But something inside him snapped. His ego couldn't take the challenge, especially not in front of his colleagues. He was the one who held the power here, not some lowly janitor. He would make sure she knew it. He would make sure everyone knew it. Victor stormed after her, his expensive shoes pounding against the marble floor as he closed the distance between them. Karen, who had just reached the elevator, pressed the button calmly, her back still turned to him. She didn't even flinch as his footsteps grew louder, closer. He was coming for her, and Karen knew exactly what he was about to do. But this time, it wasn't going to be the same. "Do you think I'll let you get away with that?" Victor's voice was a low growl, laced with venom. He was so close now that she could feel the heat of his breath on her neck. "I'll make sure you regret that little outburst, Karen. You'll be out of here faster than you can blink. No one challenges me in my own company." Karen took a deep breath, her hand still resting on the elevator button. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The power was already shifting. "You don't get it, do you, Victor?" she said softly, her voice calm, but filled with an underlying strength. "You're not the one in control here. You never were." Victor's laughter was sharp and mocking. "And what are you going to do about it? You're nothing but a cleaning lady. You think you can just walk in here and change things?" His words cut through the air like a whip, meant to belittle her, to remind her of her supposed place. But Karen didn't flinch. She didn't react the way he expected her to. Instead, she simply pressed the button again, and when the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside, still not looking back. It wasn't fear in her eyes, nor was it desperation. It was something else, something Victor couldn't recognize, something that made him feel uneasy. The doors slid shut with a soft whoosh, leaving him standing there, staring at the empty hallway. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what had just happened. But then, something inside him snapped. With a furious roar, he slammed his fist against the elevator doors, his rage consuming him. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let some lowly janitor get the better of him. He had built this company with blood, sweat, and tears, and he would not be humiliated by someone like her. The elevator doors opened again, and to Victor's surprise, it wasn't Karen who stepped out, but another figure, one of the senior managers who had been in the conference room earlier. The man looked at Victor with a mix of hesitation and uncertainty, his eyes darting nervously from the elevator to Victor's red face. "Victor," the manager began, his voice uneasy, "maybe you should cool down. You know Karen. She's always been calm. But don't forget, she's also the one who runs the charity fund, the one who manages the budget reports for several of our biggest investors. Victor's jaw tightened. He had no idea. No one had told him about Karen's involvement in the company's deeper financials. No one had mentioned that she had a hand in some of the biggest deals they were currently working on. He had underestimated her, as he had so many others. But this wasn't just about her position. It was about power. And now, it felt like Karen had something that he didn't. "She's just a janitor," Victor spat, his voice growing louder again, a wave of frustration rising in his chest. "She's nothing. She has no authority here. No one even knows who she really is." The manager hesitated again, glancing nervously around the hallway, as if unsure of how to proceed. "Victor, maybe it's best you let this go. You don't want to make an enemy of her. You're really not in the position to do that." Victor's anger flared again, but this time, the doubt creeping into his mind made him hesitate. Could Karen really have power he didn't know about? Could she have been quietly orchestrating things from the shadows all along? Before he could respond, a soft click echoed from the hallway. He turned, his face going pale as the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor grew louder. It was Karen. But this time, there was something different about her. She was no longer the invisible janitor. She wasn't even the woman they had mocked just moments ago. She was something else entirely. Someone who had seen their weaknesses and understood the game better than they ever had. Victor's blood ran cold as Karen approached him, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't need to speak. The power in her presence was enough. She knew something he didn't, and the balance of control was slipping away from his grasp. And that was when it hit him. It wasn't her cleaning skills that made Karen valuable. It was her knowledge, her connections, her influence that had remained hidden for so long. And now, the time had come for the world to see exactly what she was capable of. The air in the hallway grew thick with tension as Karen approached Victor, each step echoing louder than the last. Her presence filled the space, heavy with the kind of calm authority that made everyone around her feel the gravity of the moment. Victor could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but it wasn't just his anger that was rising. It was fear. Fear of the unknown, of the fact that he had grossly underestimated the woman who had just made him look foolish in front of everyone. Karen stopped just a few feet from him, her eyes never leaving his. She wasn't intimidated, not by his stature, not by his authority. There was a calmness in her expression, but it was the kind of calm that made Victor's hands sweat. She stood there for a moment, letting the silence hang between them, before she spoke. "You're right, Victor," she said, her voice steady but carrying an unspoken weight. "I'm just a janitor. But what you don't realize is that I'm the one who's been cleaning up your messes for years." Her words were deliberate, each one landing like a sharp, precise blow. Victor's face contorted in disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" He spat, his voice rising. "You think you can walk in here and—" "No, Victor," Karen interrupted, her tone cutting through his anger like a knife. "You think you control everything. You think you have the power, the influence. But you've been blind to what's really going on. You've been so focused on your little empire that you failed to see the bigger picture." Victor blinked, the confusion in his eyes beginning to shift into something else, something like realization. He had always believed that he was untouchable, but in that moment, he understood. Karen wasn't just a janitor. She was the one who had been running the show behind the scenes. She had known all along, but she had never shown her hand. She had played the game, watching from the sidelines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Karen stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her gaze unwavering. "You're fired, Victor," she said simply, as though she were handing him an eviction notice. The words were sharp, unyielding, and they left him frozen in place. For a moment, Victor could only stare at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You can't do this," he finally managed to shout, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm the CEO. I'm the one who built this company." Karen didn't flinch. "No, Victor. You built a company on arrogance and neglect, and now the foundation is crumbling. You're a liability to this company, and I've been more than patient with you. But your time is up." The room, which had been eerily silent up until that point, seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. The executives, who had witnessed the power struggle unfolding before them, looked on in stunned silence. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they were witnessing the end of an era or the start of something new. Victor's face twisted with anger, then humiliation, as he struggled to find his words. He was the one in control. He had been for so long. But now, all that confidence and power seemed to evaporate in an instant. Karen had flipped the script on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was no longer the dominant force in the room. He was just a man who had been outplayed. "You can't fire me," Victor stammered, his voice weak now, desperate. I built this company. His words faltered, and for the first time, his bravado cracked. Karen didn't waste another second on him. She turned away, her movements smooth and deliberate, as though she had already closed the chapter on this part of the story. "You're done, Victor. Take your things and leave. The board will be notified. You've lost." The moment she spoke those words, it felt like the air in the room shifted. The tension that had built up over the last few minutes began to break. But it wasn't a release of relief. It was more like the shattering of a glass wall. The executives who had watched the confrontation unfold began to stir, their gazes flicking nervously between Karen and Victor. They had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a woman who had been invisible to them for years now take control of their entire world with nothing but a few words. As Karen walked past Victor, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had made her point, and now she was moving on. But the message had been received loud and clear. Victor Donnelly's reign was over, and the company would never be the same again. Victor stood there, motionless, as Karen walked past him, with unwavering composure. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the hallway, each step a final nail in the coffin of his once untouchable position. His mind raced, but the words, the shock, and the crushing weight of what had just happened rendered him incapable of action. He had been fired, not by someone who had power, but by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. Behind him, the room of executives began to stir. Whispers filled the air like a storm building momentum. Their eyes darted from Karen to Victor, unsure of how to react, their loyalty to the CEO now crumbling before them. A few tried to speak, but their voices faltered in the face of the authority Karen had just demonstrated. Karen didn't look back, but her presence was undeniable. She had taken control of a situation where no one else dared to act. The power she had held in silence for years was now laid bare for all to see. The executives who had once viewed her as nothing more than a janitor now found themselves forced to reevaluate their assumptions. They had been complicit in a system that overlooked her, and they couldn't pretend they hadn't witnessed what had just unfolded. As Karen walked out of the building, the tension in the air lifted, replaced by the harsh reality of what had just occurred. The board members would soon be informed, and the company would begin its transition, but nothing would ever be the same. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Victor stood frozen, a man stripped of his power. His empire, built on pride and arrogance, had crumbled under the weight of his own disregard for the people around him. The executives who had once worshipped him now looked at him with disdain. It wasn't just Karen who had seen through him. It was everyone who had watched her rise. Victor's downfall was swift and merciless. His reputation had been torn apart in a matter of moments, and as he gathered his things, he realized the true cost of his hubris. He had thought he was untouchable, but Karen had shown him that no one is above accountability. And as she left the building, the doors behind her closing softly, Karen walked away with nothing but her dignity intact. She hadn't sought revenge. She had simply taken what was rightfully hers: respect. Karen didn't need a victory speech. She didn't need to gloat or bask in the sudden admiration that was slowly building among the employees who had witnessed her quiet revolution. The message had been delivered, loud and clear, in the most powerful way possible. No one had seen it coming, and yet everyone would remember it forever. As she stepped out of the building into the bright, crisp air, she didn't look back. The world she had just changed would continue without her, but she had proven something far more important than any fleeting moment of recognition: that no one, no matter how small or insignificant they seemed to others, should ever be underestimated. The quiet ones, the ones often overlooked, can hold more power than anyone realizes. Karen had known that all along. She hadn't needed anyone's permission to take control. She had done it on her own terms, and in doing so, she had carved her own place in a world that once refused to see her. The CEO's empire had crumbled, not because of force, but because of truth. In a single moment, Karen had shown the power of standing up for yourself, for what you know to be right, even when the odds seem impossible. She had taught a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of that company. Sometimes, the strongest voices are the ones that have been silent for too long. So, if you were inspired by Karen's courage, if you believe in standing up for what's right, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the power of resilience and the strength in quiet defiance. Because, just like Karen, you never know when your moment will come.